Well, it is great pleasure for me to be able to introduce the D.W. Brooks lecture speaker. So on behalf of the University of Georgia and the College of Agricultural and Environmental Science, I'd like to welcome Mr. Roger Thurow to our campus. In his decades as a foreign correspondent for the Wall Street Journal in Africa and in Europe, he's seen firsthand the human face of our struggle to increase the world's food supply. He's told the stories of hungry people, their struggles to feed their families, and a long history of agricultural innovations, some that have met with failure, while others with success. His experience has given him a perspective that many of us working in labs, greenhouses, experiment stations in order to end hunger don't have access to. We're excited to ask him to share a little bit of that perspective with us today. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Roger Thurow.
Thank you, Sam. Gee, I was facing this way all the time. Now I see the great crowd that has assembled. It's amazing. Thank you. And for an afternoon, it's really something. And thank you all for coming. Thank you, Sam, the whole Amrit, Vicky, everybody involved in bringing me here. In my long and winding road with the Wall Street Journal, I was actually based, I had a domestic interregnum for all the time of traveling overseas. It was based in Atlanta for 4 years in the Wall Street Journal Bureau there. And so I got out to this area a couple of times in my reporting there. So when you guys called and the offer to do this, I jumped in and said, yeah, it's a chance to get back. And I had started my career at the Wall Street Journal actually interning in the Atlanta Bureau. So it's, again, this is bringing me full circle. So I was delighted to come back here and see all the work that you're doing, and it's a great honor and delight to be here, particularly on this occasion and at D.W. Brooks Awards, and the meaning that has, and the wonderful legacy and inspiration of Professor Dr. Brooks and his family to keep this up, and the legacy, and also his wise mother. I mean, I love the comment and the quote from her, you don't feed people because they're good or feed them because they're bad. You feed people because they're hungry. And that's right, and that's the essence of it. And I think it's one of the great moral challenges and calling that we all have. And, to talk about that in 2016, 16 years into this great new millennium of ours and into the 21st century, and we still have this great task and challenge ahead of us. So it's time to continue to roll up our sleeves and keep going, and all the great and wonderful work that you guys are doing here, at this university is outstanding. And congratulations to all the award winners. I felt I knew you already because I was reading through the brochure last night, and then saw everything come to life with the videos. And so that's great, and thank you for, and as I was seeing this, I was just remembering in my own life, teachers, support people from my time, in grade school, and we can all think of favorite teachers, and high school. Then at the university, I went to the University of Iowa. And those teachers that were, inspiring and mentoring all through the time. So all your work is so greatly appreciated. So thank you for inspiring a generation of students and your fellow, faculty colleagues to take up this great task of nourishing the world, and everybody kind of marching forward in that. So well done. Thank you to that, and keep up the good work and keep it going. And so it's really great to see the passion of the award winners, kind of everybody else that I met on campus, the students that I've been meeting and talking to, and kind of the passion in this room, and I admire it so, and so greatly respect it. And I know that for many of you, and for so many people, the warriors, the people manning the front lines in the fight against hunger and malnutrition, there's one moment for many of us, when we saw something, heard something, experienced something about the horrible injustice of hunger and food insecurity that triggered your passion and continues to fuel it today and propels you on to do what you're doing. And for me, that moment came in May 2003 in Ethiopia. I was a reporter still for the Wall Street Journal at that stage, had already been a foreign correspondent for, 12, 15 years at that time. And I was doing what foreign correspondents do, moving from country to country and place to place and story to story, always on the lookout for the next great reporting adventure, the next great writing project. Where's the next story? And so in May of 2003, I went to Ethiopia to cover the first great famine, the first great hunger crisis of the 21st century. 14 million people were on the doorstep of starvation at that moment. There was a drought that was in the Horn of Africa and stretching down through East Africa, into Southern Africa. Africa was probably the hungriest then that it had been in decades and in people's memories. And it was particularly so in Ethiopia. There was a drought, but there was also, the years and the decades of neglect of agriculture development, particularly for smallholder farmers, neglect of nutrition, neglect from all sectors, from the rich world governments, from the governments in those countries themselves, from the international development agencies, from foundations, from the private sector, on agriculture development and nutrition. And it had basically led to this moment that 14 million people were on the doorstep of starvation, surviving, if they were going to survive at all, on international food aid. A lot of it United States food aid, crops grown in America that was being shipped over there and saving many lives. So my first day in Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia, I was meeting with the staff of the World Food Program, which was out in all the hunger zones, delivering frantically the food aid to as many people as they could reach, really in the deep in the bush in the rural areas of Africa and the villages that were so impacted. And we were examining a map of Ethiopia that was spread over a big conference table. I can remember it so clearly in the room or in the offices of the World Food Program. And it was a map of Ethiopia and of Africa, but particularly of Ethiopia. And they were saying, here's the hunger zones and the crisis areas and what's kind of going on here and in this area. And then we were also pointing out, so these are the areas that we're going to be going to in the next couple of days to see the hunger zones and the hunger fields. And so the next day, then we'd be traveling to some of these places. And then one of the World Food Program workers gave me a piece of advice, or what he thought was a piece of advice. I guess it was, to a great extent, but to me it also sounded like a pretty ominous warning. Because what he said was, Roger, looking into the eyes of someone dying of hunger becomes a disease of the soul. Because what you see is that nobody should have to be dying of hunger. We talked about that some, and it was like, particularly shouldn't be dying of hunger, not now, not in 2003, not 3 years into the 21st century when so much scientific achievement and technological advancement and communications technology was literally at our fingertips. Kind of what was happening, what madness was still gripping the world that we brought this hunger, this medieval suffering with us into the 21st century. But I'm thinking, a disease of the soul. I mean, whenever we travel to these places, you're always getting all sorts of medical advice and medical warnings like, well, take your malaria pills, or watch out for cholera epidemics, mind the meningitis belt. Disease of the soul. What's this guy talking about, and how do I protect myself against that? So I didn't bring any pills for that. Didn't have any shots. A disease of the soul. So the next day, we're then out in some of these hunger zones. We travel up in the south in the Wassa area, even south of that in Ethiopia, for those of you who know that area, south of Addis. And we were driving up a corkscrew road to a plateau where the famine was being particularly hard felt. And we came into a village, and there was a warren of tents that had been set up, so big olive green tents. And they were emergency feeding tents, and there were a number of them, which kind of a little village unto itself. We kind of parted the flaps of one of the tents and stepped inside. And what we saw was it was full of starving children and their parents who had brought them there. In that tent, there were like 60, some on feeding tubes, the nose tubes that they were hooked up to, others receiving all sorts of emergency feed aid and therapeutic treatment, sitting there with their parents, and their parents with deep concern, and the parents themselves were in awful shapes and various stages of just withering away and shrinking. And it was there in that tent for the first time that I really did look into the eyes of someone dying of hunger. And shame on me, for I'd been reporting in Africa for a number of years already at that stage. I'd been based in South Africa for 5 years, had traveled throughout Africa plenty. But to me, hunger, it was kind of always the background, the wallpaper of Africa. It was kind of a given to me. And shame on me for never focusing on hunger, never looking into the eyes of the starving. But as I said, there for the first time, I look into the eyes of the hungry. It does indeed become a disease of my soul. And this is one father and son in particular, Tesfaye the father. You see how thin he is with his rib cage exposed. He had carried his son, Hargirso, who's about 5 years old in this picture, to the emergency feeding tent. And Hargirso, again, he's about 5 years old, and he weighed about 27 pounds, or 29 pounds, totally emaciated, wasting away. By the time I saw him, he was starting to recover somewhat, was on an emergency feeding regimen, but still woefully malnourished. We'll get to those guys later. So just one word of caution with the new technology. Of all the time I worked at the Wall Street Journal, most of the time we didn't even run pictures in the paper. So kind of all this, the videos and photo slideshows, this is all brave new world for me. So if we go like racing ahead, it's because it's like, yeah, I don't know what I'm doing with this thing. And so Hargirso, 27, 29 pounds or so, 5 years old, starting to recover a little bit, but his face still so swollen, his head, his arms from the malnutrition. He's so weak, his arms, his legs, so weak and thin, he can't stand up, so he's basically propped up between the legs of his dad. And you look into these eyes, and they're lifeless. They're dark. There's a hopelessness to them. There's not even any beseeching or any playfulness that you would expect in a little child. And kind of the guilt from his father. And as I'm talking this way, what have I done to bring my child to such a state? Then as we talked, and I talked to some of the other families, and the doctors and nurses and the emergency relief, workers. And then it was, dawned on me, no, it's not so much what Tesfaye as the father had done, but what we had all done, that we had allowed this hunger, this famine, to be manifest and to bring it again into the 21st century. So what I did see did indeed become this disease of my soul. And that became, for me, my moment of great disruption. As a person, as a member of the human race, and as a reporter. For what I saw as this ever-wandering foreign correspondent stopped me cold. And I knew that this is one story that I just couldn't write and leave and move on to another story, new adventure. This is the one story I had to keep coming back to over and over and over again, the story of hunger in the 21st century. So my diseased soul kept coming back, and when I left Hargirso and his father, we didn't know, all the nurses and doctors were saying, we don't know if he's going to survive because he's had such a severe shock. So all this time in my reporting, as I continue to write about this story through other parts of Africa, other places in the developing world, these are the eyes, this is the motivation, this is the diseased soul that is continuing to carry me forth. And so I'm writing these stories and proposing ever new stories for the Wall Street Journal about this. And for most of the time, the editors of the Wall Street Journal, they're like interested and they're running these stories, and it's like, Roger, what's next? I'd say, well, there's this story. No, what's next do you have anything more to say about on the hunger front? I'd say, sure, there's all sorts of stories to do. But at some stage, as editors will, they would say, gee, can we have covered that story already? What's new on this new proposal that you're talking about? And I would say, what's new? They're still hungry. That's what's new. That's what's compelling. That's what's outrageous. So my mantra as a journalist that I developed then became outrage and inspire. To outrage readers with hunger in the 21st century, with malnutrition, with the failures, with the negligence, with the political will that's been failing. Because hunger, above all, and malnutrition is a political condition. But we haven't mustered the political will to get to overcome this. And the outrages that I kept coming across in my reporting were many. Chiefly, again, hunger in the 21st century, which then becomes this broad theme. And again, how we had brought this medieval suffering with us into this grand new millennium through negligence and indifference and this lack of political will to end this scourge. One of the results of this is this most cruel irony that the hungriest people in our world, the hungriest people in Africa certainly, and elsewhere in the developing world, the hungriest people are farmers. Hungry farmers. I mean, what kind of a stupid, asinine, obscene, absurd oxymoron is that? Hungry farmers. They're people who get up every morning, and in a lot of these places, they step out the door of their little huts or houses, and they're almost in their fields because they're right there. That's what they get up to do every day, and for the most part, they can't grow enough food to feed their families, let alone have a surplus to have money, to sell, for money to send their kids to school or put a decent roof on their house, buy malaria medication. Hungry farmers. So eventually I come back to the United States after 20 years abroad, and I'm in the Chicago Bureau. I'm from Northern Illinois, so I come almost back to whence I came. And came back to the Chicago Bureau to write about poverty and social issues in the US. And before long, I'm confronting another outrage and another obscene, absurd oxymoron in the United States. Hungry Americans. I mean, 1 in 4 children, 1 in 5 children in our country are living in food insecure households where their parents don't know at some stage during the year where their next meal will come from, if they can afford their next meal. It's not a matter of, we're too busy, we didn't have time to cook anything or to have a new meal. It's this fear of, I don't know if we have enough money to afford the next meal. So my diseased soul is then propelling me to write about that and our domestic condition of hunger while still doing things abroad. So see, these outrages, and then hopefully by writing these things, to have the inspiration, we can do something about this. We can muster the political will. We can summon, as David Beckman, a Lutheran minister who's the head of Bread for the World and a winner of the World Food Prize laureate, as David would say, to summon and to muster up this give a damn. And I particularly like that because it's a preacher who's using this language. And I said, well, it must be important. It's something that we really got to do, to muster the give a damn and the political will to get on top of this. So that then brings me to my current outrage. I'm a fairly outraged person, I guess. My current outrage was then at the center of my most recent book, The First 1,000 Days, a crucial time for mothers and children in the world. And that outrage is that 1 in 4 children in our world today are stunted because of malnourishment, particularly in the 1,000 days. The 1,000 days is the time from when a woman becomes pregnant to the second birthday of the child. And it's this time of critical development, both physically but also cognitive development, and the building up of antibodies and everything that then will and immune systems to keep the baby strong through childhood and then into life. So stunting physically, cognitively, or both in most cases. The stunting is you hear the word stunting. It's such a harsh word. It's an ugly word. It's stunting. It's an offensive word. What is stunting? Stunting is basically a life sentence of underachievement and underperformance, which is rendered in most cases by the end of the 1,000-day period. By the time a child's 2 or 3. It's at that time when the brain is growing most rapidly and expansively and fueled by nutrition. So anything there that then harms or sets back the cognitive development. It's the most important period of individual human development. It's in that time that shapes a child's ability to grow, learn, earn later in life, and to thrive. And by extension, it's the most important time in not only individual human development, but in the development of families, of communities, of countries, of societies, of indeed of the world in which we live. It's the most important period for the development of healthy, prosperous, stable, secure societies. And good nutrition is then the cornerstone of all that development in the 1,000 days. You know, the physical growth, again, the cognitive growth, the strengthening of the immune system. The good nutrition is the accelerant of all of this. You know, the vital micronutrients, the vitamins, the minerals that are so important both in the period when a mom is pregnant, during the breastfeeding time, and certainly then when the child begins eating solid foods and the complementary feeding. Boy, these nutrients are so important at that time for everything that's going on. The first 1,000 days, as I said, is the time when the brain develops most rapidly and expansively, when these cognitive, executive functions that everybody at the university and all the students are using every minute, every second of the day, when they start forming and beginning to form. It's a time when genes become turned on and off, determining the future health of the child, and a lot of that, those signals being sent by the food, the lack of nutrients that the mother is eating during the 1,000 days, that the signals are already coming to the child, gee, I'm going to be born into a world of scarce resources. My body better change and adjust to that, to conserve sugar, to conserve fat, to conserve energy. So all these things are already going on in the body. The relations of the child to the relations of food, of the child to food, are already being established in that time. It's a time when nurturing and stimulation of the caregivers to the child is most important. And again, the time when preconditions for chronic diseases later in life are established. Because what happens is a malnourished child, a stunted child, becomes a stunted adult. And the cost of malnutrition, less education, a less productive workforce, a weaker, sicker population, that rolls through time and it rolls across place and across society. You know, the cost of and it's great that there's so many that are studying ag economics because kind of the numbers and the impact of this are quite important. The impact of stunting, 1 in 4 children in the world being stunted, of childhood malnutrition. The impact it's like you throw a pebble into a pond and all these ripples come out from that pebble, from the placid water. Then the ripples spread and they eventually end up at our own feet. It's the same with stunting. So the first ripple from a stunted child is obviously to the individual himself. And we know from there's very few cases, but they're really interesting, that have been following malnourished and stunted children over time. Some in Guatemala have started in the late 60s and early 70s. So now the children are well into adulthood, so they're able to study all these things and how they performed in school and on the workforce, and now, their ability to ward off chronic diseases. For an individual, it's less time in school, a couple of grades fewer. It's a lower ability to learn when they're in school. It's fewer job prospects, lower productivity on a job. The malnourished, stunted children then earn 20 to 40% less in wages as adults. They have this higher propensity for chronic disease, diabetes, heart problems. The next ripple then is the family and the impact of the family. It makes their climb out of poverty that much steeper when one of the children, if there's one child, they have more children. If one child is malnourished and stunted, probably more of them are, and the siblings are. They're less than full wage earners that the parents are depending on. There's higher health care costs that are then borne throughout the lifetime of this child. The ripples widen to the whole communities. There's the weakened labor pool and the lack of opportunity and education of the workforce in those communities. The ripples widen then more to countries and to regions. And there's countries that are now doing studies and economic analysis of the cost of childhood stunting and malnutrition. And they're seeing that the equivalent loss of GDP and economic activity might be 6, 8, 10% of GDP activity in places like India, Uganda, Guatemala. Ethiopia, they did their calculations, 16% loss of GDP every year because of the cumulative effect of stunted children. And it's not a static number. Oh, we have this many that are stunted in 2014. No, that's a rolling number that keeps repeating itself year after year, and it's just a cumulative impact. And in some of these countries, their percentage of the stunted population of children under 5 is 30, 40, 50%. It's a staggering toll on the economic activity of those countries and their competitiveness in the world. regional ripple. In both sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, those regions of the world calculate that they lose the equivalent of 11% of GDP because of the high rates of childhood malnutrition and stunting. And those regions are the regions with the greatest number of absolute numbers and the highest percentages of malnourished and stunted children. I mean, you wonder why some places in the world remain so poor. It's because their children are getting off to a lousy start in life. They have awful, terrible first 1,000 days. And then the final ripple is the world. I mean, several $1 trillion, the World Bank figures, and others that are crunching these numbers. Several $1 trillion lost each year, a couple percentage points of global GDP because of the cost of healthcare, lower productivity, reduced trade between these countries that have their diminished GDPs. So clearly we can see that a malnourished, stunted child anywhere becomes a stunted child everywhere, and those ripples do indeed end up at our own feet. So we see that ending malnutrition and stunting is not only the right thing to do, as Professor Brooks's mother reminded him, it's the right thing to do, it's also the smart thing to do. What are we doing to ourselves that we've gotten to this stage of 1 in every 4 children in the world are stunted, 1 in 3 in the developing world? So as a journalist, I'm seeing all these numbers and statistics, and this outrage then is growing within me. And I'm thinking, so as a journalist, what can I do? How can I tell the story of this? How can I bring this to life? To illuminate the faces, the voices, the emotions of this and what it means in a storytelling manner. So what I decided to do, in kind of flight of fancy and grand ambition, was I decided to follow moms and their children through the 1,000-day period, which is pretty long, by the way, longer than I recognized when I had this ambition, to follow these moms and children through the 1,000 days in 3 parts of the world: India, Uganda, Guatemala, and Chicago. And Chicago basically to show, look, it's not just a problem over there somewhere. This is something that's also really important to us in the United States and what's happening in the 1,000 days. Because it's in the 1,000 days where our escalation in overweight and obesity begins, where the increase in chronic illnesses begin, where underperformance in school begins. Poor nutrition for us in the United States in the 1,000 days impacts our finances, resulting in higher healthcare costs that strain our budgets. It saps our competitiveness on many fronts. It poses a threat to our national security. There's an organization in Washington called Mission Readiness. It's an organization of retired military brass from all sectors of the military. They came out with a fascinating report a couple of years ago, and it was entitled "Too Fat to Fight." What they found was that 70% of Americans age 17 to 24 are unfit for military service. And it begins in 1,000 days. And they say that in there, in early childhood development. It's similar to a call 60 years ago, again from our nation's military, that led to the formation of the school lunch and the school breakfast programs because too many young men were malnourished and unfit for the draft in World War II. 70% of our 17 to 24 years olds unfit for service in the military. And so I then followed these moms and their children through the 1,000 days. And I'll just, for full disclosure, I did not start on day 1 of the 1,000 days. That'd have been like creepy. And I would have been deported and expelled from a lot of these places before the reporting even began, let alone having my face slapped a lot. Because in some of these places, these aren't questions that you ask too much. So I start following the moms and their children, basically the moms 3, 4, 5 months into their pregnancy, a couple of the moms like right before they're giving birth. And so what I just wanted to leave you with is some of the faces, emotions, and images from the moms, the families, and the children. So this is Uganda, and just some of the lessons that I learned in doing this. This is Brenda is the mom, and little Aaron, he's about 13, 14 months old. At this stage when I first met Brenda, she's about 5 or 6 months pregnant. She had a big smile on her face, but as I talked to her, I could see that smile really kind of belied a deep sorrow that she was carrying. And then the more that we talked, it's her first child. She had lost her first child within the first couple of weeks The baby seemed to be born okay, but then got an infection from the hospital. And she was telling me, look, during that pregnancy, she was dizzy. She felt weak, had headaches very frequently. She couldn't work that much in the field, and she's a farmer. These folks are in northern Uganda, the moms that I'm following there. And so when I see her, and she's telling me all this, it's like, well, okay, so now you're pregnant again, pregnant for the second time, and how's that going? Oh, this pregnancy, I have much more energy. And her husband confirms that, oh yeah, she's in the field every day, and hopefully they're in the field, and she's in the field until the time the baby comes and she delivers. And I don't have any headaches and no dizziness, and I'm feeling strong and robust all the time. And I said, well, what's the difference? And she says, you know, the only thing that's changed in our community is we started growing these new crops. We started growing orange flesh sweet potatoes, rich in beta-carotene, which the body turns into vitamin A. And we're growing high iron beans with a high elevated iron content. So we all know, gee, vitamin A and iron, just essential, so important minerals and nutrients in this 1,000-day period for the pregnant moms during the breastfeeding and then when the child begins. And this is all under a program of biofortification, which many of you may know about. Harvest Plus, the organization that's kind of been pioneering with that. It's conventional breeding. There's no GMOs involved. It's just raising the mineral content, the nutrient content that's already in a lot of these staple foods. And it's then through the staple foods that they're eating every day, several times a day, that you can then deliver these essential vitamins and minerals to them that they may not get because they're not eating, you know, bread or brushing their teeth with toothpaste that's fortified in some way. They may not be taking the iron and folic acid supplements because it's a really rural area, and the distribution out there, and then the monitoring that are you actually taking these. So she says, no, I'm feeling great. That's the only thing that's changed in my life. And so there we can see kind of this great attempt and movement and a really, you know, great new frontier, I guess, in agriculture development is to merge and bring agriculture and nutrition closer together. And that nutrition is an essential part of agriculture, nutrition of the crops that then the people are eating. So thinking of the consumer of the crops in addition to the farmer, and increasing farmer yields and increasing farmer income, which had always been the #1 goal of agriculture. And now it's like, no, you need to add this nutritional component to it. It's really important. And then these are the results. So Aaron is born, and he's a healthy boy. And he's about 8 pounds old when he's born. And he's developing, his development signals are all great. Brenda's really happy about that. And I go back at one stage and I visit, and I say, you know, Brenda and Aaron's maybe 6, 7 months old at the time. How's Aaron? She gets a panicked look on her face and she begins to weep. Aaron hasn't grown much since the last time you were here. His development seems to have stopped. And I said, well, what happened? And then she tells me the story about how the well water in their area had gone bad. An older resident of the area had gotten dysentery. That was rapidly followed by Brenda getting dysentery, other members of her family getting dysentery, little Aaron getting dysentery. She's telling me this story like a month or 2 after it happens. Aaron had recovered, fortunately, but it was still so great of a worry and concern on her mind that she's weeping as she's telling me this, because her concern was, am I losing my second child too? And what this shows that despite all our efforts on the nutrition front and the agriculture front, and hooray for that and the advances on that, that can be so easily undermined by a couple of sips of bad water, by a mosquito bite and malaria. And so as the narrative goes, and you'll read in the book, the moms, the children, the dads, everybody kind of down with malaria frequently. Elements of stupid poverty, you know, that Bono says. What? Still a mosquito's bite in 2016? Bad water? Undermining all these things. So it's kind of this point that, yeah, nutrition is great, but it's and the agricultural efforts and agricultural development, but you need kind of this development in lockstep that moves forward simultaneously. There's Aaron as he's coming close to 2. He loves his sweet potatoes. Brenda had picked them in the morning. That was the lunch. That was the dinner. Greens, beans, peanuts as the sauce, which she's also growing. India. Shyam Kali, the mom, and Shika, little daughter, this is taken within the first 36 hours of birth. And in India, what I wanted to capture was the essence of all of this, of behavior change, and how vital that is, both the education of nutrition, of what are the nutritious foods, how do you cook them, how do you develop a taste for them and get them into your diets, your diversified diets, that's all important. But then again, other things that can undermine that. So what Shyam Kali was saying, that before this organization called the Community Empowerment Lab came into their village and started with behavior change teaching and education, the moms would routinely discard the first breast milk right after birth because they figured it was part of the afterbirth, it was dirty, it was polluted, it was inhabited by evil spirits. So that was discarded. And of course, the first breast milk has the colostrum in it, which is so full of and rich in antibodies, which is really good for establishing the immune system. So what this Community Empowerment Lab in India was trying to do was attack the extraordinary high, and this is in Uttar Pradesh, the extraordinarily high infant mortality rate, first day deaths, first week deaths, first month deaths. And that was really high because, for a couple of reasons. One, infections, because of weakened immune systems from the get-go. Also infections caused by using dirty blades to cut the umbilical cord. Hypothermia, because the baby would be laid on its own, unwrapped, unclothed, while they tended to the mother. And so he has to then come in and say, no, how do we change these things? And he's an Indian doctor, Vishwajit Kumar, and you'll meet him in the book, trained at Johns Hopkins in the School of Public Health. And how do we change all these things so that there is the first breast milk, the colostrum gets to the child? One factor that they hadn't been able to change, and they had great success. So within 18 months of this behavior change strategy and education in the communities, the moms, the dads, the mothers-in-law who were really important in these places, they're saying, I didn't do that. Why should this child? Why should my child? Why should my grandchild? We do that for that. To get that through, within 18 months, they had basically reduced their infant mortality rate in half. So everybody could see, wow, this is improving and having an impact, so that helped with the adaptation of these things. This is one of the practices that was still really hard to overcome. It's what's called confinement. And so for the first 2 weeks or a certain number of days after the birth, the mom and the child are alone in a room of the house by themselves. No one else comes in. And again, to ward off evil spirits, that little brick and the ashes there, that's a dung brick that's filled with incense. You can see some of the smoke that's blowing around. After about 5 or 10 minutes in there myself, my eyes started to burn and my throat was so burning that I had to leave and go outside and get some fresh air. This is the first air that this child is breathing for the first 2 weeks of life with very tender lungs. And imagine the impact that that is having. So in subsequent trips when I would go back, how's Anshika? I just took her to the doctor for respiratory problems. She has a cough. Again, all these other efforts to conquer these things and behavior change then undercut by that. There's Anshika too. She's a beautiful girl. Physically, she's stunted in terms of height. And we'll see on the cognitive development as time goes along. Guatemala. Maria Estela, the mom. Jorge is the boy that followed through the 1,000 days. And he's about 2 years old here. That's his sister in the back. Jessica, she's almost 4. She's twice his age. So there they are, basically is coming up to 2 years old. Jorge's robust. He was born at 8 pounds, 9 pounds. He's been growing, developing all his development markers, his walking, his crawling, his walking. His talking, all far advanced than his sister. She's still sucking his thumb. He's left that behind a long time ago. She's a picky eater. She's sickly, the mom says. She doesn't talk that much. What happened in between these children is that Maria Estela joins a nutrition rehabilitation program in her village that a clinic called Primeros Pasos is starting to institute. There she learns all the things about these vegetables and fruits that we're supposed to eat, that they're growing themselves as farmers, and these is in the western highlands of Guatemala, the primarily Maya areas, and there the malnutrition and stunting rates are 70% of the children. It's the worst in the Western Hemisphere. It's worse in Haiti. Everybody is stunted. So when you say there's a stunting problem in these villages, they say, what's the problem? We all look the same. That's the problem. And so what this then shows is that through this nutrition knowledge, we think, oh, this is a problem that's going to take generations, a generation or generations to overcome. It doesn't have to. It can be overcome between children in the same family, within a generation. And so that you have Jorge then, who's really robust, and everybody in the community and the family is really proud of this guy, and he's really growing, as opposed to Jessica, and there's 2 years between them. And so that these efforts can have an impact, and it can have an impact in a hurry. Finally, Chicago. One of the moms, Jessica, she's was a teen mom, gave birth as a junior in high school. Alitzel's her child. And what we see in Chicago, I mean, is you see kind of the same need for behavior change. Jessica and the other moms that I'm following, they're all talking about their need to overcome their addiction to flaming hot Cheetos and Takis and all this bad food and junk food that they're eating, and they know that they shouldn't. And so they're getting the same nutrition lessons that all these other moms are then getting from the doula program, from social works programs in there, and social service programs in their areas. And so the behavior change is as important in our societies and communities as anywhere else. And also what's going on in Chicago, and you see the importance of the environment in which these children, the moms are pregnant and the children are being born. The time, the 1,000 days that I'm following them coincides with the dramatic increase in violence on the south side of Chicago. And you can see how that is wearing on Jessica, even as she's carrying her child, this toxic stress, as they call it, the impact that has also in the 1,000 days and on cognitive development. Jessica is writing letters to her unborn child occasionally during her pregnancy. And in there she's writing about advice to her unborn child. Don't end up in jail. Don't be arrested. Don't join gangs. You want to be known? Do good in school. Your teachers will know you. The community will know you. Graduate high school. Go to college. That's how you'll be known. Don't end up in jail. So how all this is impacting her, what kind of world am I bringing my child into? And so also then Chicago, the first major city then mapped for food deserts. And so Rahm Emanuel, at the conference I was moderating on the 1,000 days in Chicago and the importance of the domestic of it, the mayor was talking about, so food deserts. And he says, when I see food deserts, I see opportunity deserts. Because where there's a food desert, there's a jobs desert, there's an education desert, there's a security desert, there's a health desert. All of these social issues that we're dealing with in our cities, in our communities, and even in our rural areas here, are kind of all wound up with availability of food, the 1,000 days of the children, what kind of start do they get off in life? And he's talking about, the state of our schools and failing schools in the United States. How much is that the children aren't even prepared to learn once they get there because they haven't had proper nutrition and proper cognitive development in this period? And what you find in all these places is that poverty then becomes the big trump card for all this knowledge. Knowledge, yes, is power, but the inability to put that knowledge into play because you're too poor, you can't afford the food, the neighborhoods are too violent to go to the shops or to go to the farmer markets to get it, then that knowledge becomes a burden. I know what to do, but I can't put this into play. So there's Ali's fellas too. She's the tallest of the children at 2 by that stage, so certainly not stunted physically, and hopefully she's fine cognitively. Now, I just wanted to go back to Ethiopia, Tesfaye and Hargirso. So I leave there with my diseased soul, and I'm thinking all the time, well, whatever happened to Hargirso? I begin reporting on this book, on the 1,000 days. He had such a horrible 1,000 days, because even though he was 5 years old at this time, from the time he was born, his father is saying his mother was very sickly, and I met her. She's small, and just a tiny woman, and they always had food problems, nutrition problems, and so Hargirso was always kind of the smallest, the most vulnerable in the family. The famine happens. He's the one that is really severely impacted by this. Whoop. And so I then talked to, see, there I go again. Erase that image from your head. It's the punchline of the whole thing that I've been leading up to. No. I didn't even touch anything. I'm just waving it around. So I'm wondering, okay, so Hargirso, did he survive? And so I talked to the World Food Program people again, and they said, oh yeah, we know we still work in that area, in that plateau. We'll see. And so a couple days later, oh, hey, we found Tesfaye. Tesfaye is still there. He's still in the same place. Hargirso was there too. So I'm thinking, okay, Hargirso survived. And so kind of back up the Corkscrew Road on the way to Uganda, stop in Ethiopia, back up the Corkscrew Road to the plateau, pull up in front of the little group of houses, huts where Tesfaye and his family lives. Tesfaye comes like running out from a group of trees. He's got a machete in one hand and he's running toward him. He's like, oh my God, what's going to happen here? He's still carrying his machete and he comes and he embraces me. And I said, do you remember me? And he says, yes. When my child was so sick and was in the emergency feeding tent, you wrote down our names. I said, I did. And now I've come back. How is Hargirso? Oh, Hargirso, he's okay. He did indeed survive. So Hargirso comes running out. He calls Hargirso and he comes running out. 10 years later, 15 years old. This is the face, this is the embodiment of stunting, this harsh word, this life sentence of underachievement and underperformance. He's 15 years old. Tesfaye is not a giant, so on me he comes up to the bottom of my ribcage at about 15 years old, but he's happy. He's got a big smile on his face, and he's telling me that he's so excited he's in school. I said, you're in school? Well, that's great. And Tesfaye is kind of rolling his eyes and said, he's been pestering me all this time to go to school, but I figured he was too small, too weak, to take advantage of school. But he really wanted to go. So, yes, he's in school. It's down the road. They say, well, can I go? Yes, please come with me to school, says Hargirso. So he goes off to school, and then a little bit later, we go down there, see the teachers. Oh, I come to see Hargirso. Yes, he's in that building. Go to his classroom. So there he is. Hooray, he's in school. 15 years old, first grade. Cognitive stunting. That day he was learning the alphabet, the vowel consonant combination, the B's, bee-ba, bo, boo, bye. He's writing his notebook for the first time. He's learning his alphabet. All these other children, he seems to fit in. They're 7, 8, 9 years old. There were other first graders in the class. He wasn't even the oldest in the class. There was a 16-year-old and a 17-year-old also in first grade classes, also from that same cohort and cadre that was so severely impacted by the stunting at that time. So Hargirso, the face of stunting, I just want to finish by reading one paragraph of the book, The Final Ripple of the Impact. I talked about the other ripples. Those are big numbers. But perhaps the greatest cost of malnutrition and stunting are immeasurable. A poem not written, a song not sung, a novel not imagined, a gadget not invented, a building not designed, a mystery not solved, a horizon not explored, an idea not formed, an inspiration not shared, an innovation not nurtured, a cure not discovered, a kindness not done. What might a child have contributed to the world if he or she hadn't been stunted in 1,000 days? A lost chance at greatness for one is a lost chance for all. That's why everything that you do here is so important and so vital in this great task and challenge that we're facing of nourishing the world, ending hunger, ending malnutrition, ending stunting. So keep up the good work. Congratulations to all you who are so inspiring, and thank you. Thank you. I've gone on too long. I delayed you from your reception. And shame on a journalist for preventing anybody from getting to the bar. It's like an awful thing. I don't know.
If any of us needed greater motivation for why we get up every morning, I think today's lecture is a great example of that. So students that are studying, when you get tired and weary, remember what the goal is. And we are certainly grateful for Roger for the fact that he has brought time to us. We will entertain some questions from the audience, both here physically with us and remotely. If you are remote, please use your moderator type on your question into the comments box, and we will read your questions. If you are here in Athens, please stand and wait for one of our red-jacketed students to bring you a microphone. So any questions for Roger? Down here.
I also love these boutonnieres.
Hey.
Georgia roses, I take it. Yes.
Thank you for coming here. A couple questions. First, when you were writing all these stories in Wall Street Journal, and people who read Wall Street Journal are pretty educated and I guess sophisticated, did you get a lot of emails how worried they are and how they can contribute to the problem, to solving the problem. And the second, while in developing countries, I understand the problem of malnourishing and malnutrition. And in Chicago, the lady, was it the people? I don't want to say ignorant, but they just don't know what is the right thing to do, because they have, in a lot of times in America, we have access to programs and good food, and all we have to do is cook. What seems to be the main problem here in America? Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, and hopefully is illustrated as you kind of read through the narrative and see, with the moms in Chicago. They're all on SNAP, on food stamps. They're all on WIC, Women and Infant Children programs. And you see how truly valuable those programs are. God bless us in this country that we have this kind of bulwark against deep hunger and malnutrition. But it does come to this whole same aspect that you then see in all these other countries. And so one of the great surprises to me in reporting this from all these 4 distinct different places is kind of these commonalities. And one is this need for education. I think, observing the moms during their pregnancy, I think the most common craving of pregnant moms around the world is for education and for knowledge, and particularly if it's the first pregnancy, but then even for the subsequent ones, well, what's new? What more do I need? And particularly on the nutrition front. What should I myself be eating? What's best for the child? Then when the child is starting to take solid foods, what's best for that? So in our country, and you can say, yeah, so there's no nutrition education, or very little of it in schools. So Jessica, she's in high school. She's not learning anything about what to do. She's just seeing billboards in the high school saying, hey, don't become a teen mom or a teen dad. Your life will be over. And there's one that had kind of a series of narrowing windows. And I said, gee, what's it like to walk past that every day? And she says, yeah, it's horrible. I stopped looking at it. This is the situation that I find myself in. Certainly wasn't planned. So there's this kind of the whole support. The national nutrition guidelines in the United States that are put out and curated by the USDA and the Department of Health and Human Services, our nutrition guidelines in the U.S. start at age 2. They start after the 1,000 days. There's nothing there and fortunately in the last Farm Bill, somebody in Congress said, hey, the next time you put these things out, the next guidelines, which come out every 5 years, I think, back it up and start with birth. So now they got a big B24, birth to 24-month period that they're examining. They said, oh yeah, we'll include that in the next one that comes out in 2020. It's like, geez, it's got to take you that long to figure this out? Again, so much of it is common sense. It's no-brainer things, but in practice, these are revolutionary practices because you see, and what it gets down to, I kept thinking of, yeah, my mother, all your mothers were right. The advice that they gave to us, wash your hands, eat your vegetables. Prevents so many problems. It's all so germane in the 1,000 days to wash your hands, to avoid the parasites and the worms and the uncleanly environments and the water sanitation and health that's so important, and eat your vegetables. But putting that into play in so many places of the world, including in our country, is a rarity. And this knowledge of how to, and also the cooking knowledge. So these moms, in Chicago, when they're sitting around and they're talking, and you'll hear, and teachers in schools and people in social organizations, the doulas, the home visitation people, they're saying we hear so many things from the moms that, they're talking about food. The only way they know how to prepare chicken is fried. They talk about swapping recipes and it's deep fried Twinkies. It's not, they see all sorts of things. There's Mountain Dew in the baby bottles. There's chocolate mixed in with the formula milk or even with the mother's milk. All sorts of things that are going on that you think, how can this happen? But again, this behavior change is so important in our countries, in our place as well. I guess the first part, yeah, with the Wall Street Journal, so a lot of that time, so there was no internet or emails. Fortunately, I guess. But it was, yeah, you'd hear and hope, and that's the outrage and inspire, that's the inspire part of the mantra, that I hope it inspires. So having the invitation to talk to all of you is great. To be able to do this and continue barnstorming on the book and to get it into classrooms. And also, on the nutrition front, the med schools. So the people preparing to be doctors and studying, they're there for years, right? Their amount of nutrition education is probably less than 30 minutes. in 5, 6, 7, 8 years of study? How do we change that? How do we allow that to happen? Can't we shove a little bit of that in there? You know, and so it's all these kind of institutional things. So it's not just the people themselves, but it's like, where's the support of this?
Roger's going to be with us through this evening. We have a reception immediately following this. I do want to remind you that the college has a food drive, and it apropos that this kind of fell. In many buildings in the college, there are bins. I hope that you will be motivated to put something in those bins in the days to come. And Roger, as a small token of our appreciation, we have a piece of pottery that was made from Georgia clay and by a Georgia potter. But we have promised we will ship it to him. Not that we don't think Delta baggage handlers do a nice job, but we will get this to you. So let's give Roger a great round of applause.
And we know we can count on the mailroom to get it to me, right?
Amen. Amen.
Thank you.
So remember, we do have a reception immediately out in the lobby area, and Roger will be here, and I'm sure he'll be happy if you let him get some punch and maybe something to eat in between his questions. Thank you all for coming. Look forward to seeing you again next year.
Thank you.
Sure, that'd be great.